Good Sunday specimens. The topic of discussion of today is looking at several specs after we have had enough time inside of 9.1 to see which of them have changed home, which of them have migrated to a different country and are now playing on a different covenant. Many have tried, many have speculated, perhaps theory crafted, perhaps even wasted several hours of their life trying to get up to renown with a different covenant only to realize it was shit. Some of these are actually not going to be shit, they are in fact going to be very strong. So, what we are looking at today then is the strongest specs making the transition from one covenant to a different one in 9.1. We are not going to cover specs that were already on quite a big shift before the patch came through. So specs like Holy Paladin, for example, was already moving into Venthyr well before 9.1. So we are not going to give the patch credit for Holy Paladins going to play Venthyr, for example. But there are other specs that have definitely been given the final push, the ultimate decision in accepting the fact that it was time to move to a different covenant, starting with this patch. So the first one in line is going to be something we have talked about just yesterday, so it's going to be, the easiest one to go through, which is Windwalker Monk. It is also, if you will, a matter of percentages, because this is not a complete blowout of the new covenant change. Windwalker, much like the rest of its crew over at Monks, had been Kyrian for the majority of the expansion. Monks have tried out the other covenants and they decided almost unanimously that Venthyr was awful, Night Fae was okay, but Necrolord could have done that thing better, and then also that Necrolord was not as good as Kyrian. Now, getting into 9.1, we have more and more Monks, Windwalker, playing Necrolord. It is still a somewhat even divide, but there is more and more players going Necrolord. Necrolord offers an easier time in execution due to its major ability, Bone Dust Brew, having a 1-minute cooldown. You, as a monk, as a Windwalker monk, are naturally gifted with Storm, Earth and Fire, which is a very flexible cooldown with 2 charges that you can pick and choose when to use, and it makes it very easy to be able to line it up with Bone Dust Brew. This has further increased the ability of monks for quick, short windows of burst, thanks to Storm and Fire now coupled with Bone Dust Brew, and every other one of these windows they can pile on top of this combination. Zhuen, the White Tiger, which has a 2-minute cooldown and was previously just used with Weapons of Order, the Kyrian ability having a 2-minute cooldown. We do have, however, some more interesting and, more importantly, way more popular switches of Covenant, because Rogue is also on the list. What is also interesting to point out about Rogue is that this is not only a switch of Covenant, but also from a spec that was barely played before 9.1 to a spec that is now gaining and growing in popularity as the weeks go by. The one in question is, of course, Subtlety Rogue. Subtlety Rogue, up until a few weeks ago, was in a brutal, harrowing, almost nightmarish mud fight with survival to not be the least played melee DPS spec. This has changed, of course, in 9.1. Subtlety Rogue is now the second more popular rogue specs and is getting towards the middle of the pack of all of the specs, possibly and likely growing in the future as they continue to perform well. Now, Sub-Rogue, for the majority of Castornatria, the first many months of Castornatria, was Night Fae. It stayed Night Fae, and for the majority of that time they were playing with the Finality Legendary, their basically finisher, empowering legendary. As we had gotten closer to 9.1, it's not that Venthyr or Rogue Venthyr in and of itself was buffed, or certain parts of Subtlety were buffed that made sense to switch into Venthyr. What happened primarily for them was that 9.1 introduced the Covenant-specific legendaries, not something that mattered to Windwalker. As we talked about multiple times when talking about Windwalker, they already had a very strong legendary, and it would have been very unlikely for a Covenant-specific legendary to take over what Windwalker was already using. But what we also talked about when talking about rogues, the Covenant abilities that Rogue had at their disposal were actually kind of weak. They were nowhere near the powerful effect of Weapons of Order, for example, of Windwalker Monk. They were more like a battle of who was the least bad that you had to choose from. Blizzard went on a mission of buffing those abilities and then further increased their possible power by releasing these Covenant-specific legendaries synergizing with the ability. The one in question for Subtlety and Venthyr rogues as a whole is Obedience. Obedience being the legendary which buffs your Flagellation, your Venthyr Covenant ability. Flagellation in and of itself is a good single target ability, which also gives you stacking haste. Flagellation as a legendary gives you versatility on top of the haste gain and reduces its cooldown. Generally speaking, this is a 20 to 25-ish second cooldown reduction, so your 90-second cooldown on Flagellation is going to go down to around 70. This is a pretty good all-purpose use legendary because while the damage is only on single target, this is not something like Wild Spirits, is not something like Boon of the Ascended or Bone Dust Brew. It's not hitting multiple targets, it's just hitting one, but it does give you haste and versatility, so you can benefit from those secondary stat buffs in AoE as well. As such, this legendary is also used in AoE, it's also used on multi-target, on cleave, on single target. Pretty much all of the instances of damage of sub-rogues are going to be using this legendary as Venthyr. And as mentioned, the switch was much more potent compared to the Windwalker one, since there is like 98, 97, 96% of sub-rogues for both PvE content, Mythic Plus and Raids, going to Venthyr. The cooler part and the better synergy that they can have, sub-rogues, is the fact that their main cooldowns that they can use every time are Symbols of Death with a 30-second cooldown and Shadow Dance with a 1-minute cooldown, even less when they're using Enveloping Shadows, you know, a 40-ish second cooldown in AoE is going to be even less. This shortness of cooldowns makes it very easy to always basically guarantee that you can have your Symbols of Death and your Shadow Dance whenever Flagellation is available and have a very powerful short burst of damage, very similar to Windwalker. For Sub-Rogue is going to be more powerful on single target and on funnel single target damage, whereas for Windwalker is going to be stronger in AoE, but they can work in a similar way. On to the next one, which we have already covered a few days ago, is Elemental Shaman. Elemental Shaman previously used to be Necrolord. This was a situation similar in depression to what rogues were in. The Covenant abilities at the disposal of shamans were not particularly exciting. They had some cool possible ideas, they could have been applied to some interesting scenarios, but many of them were rather niche. They weren't that much of an all-purpose use Covenant ability like Elysian Decree for Vengeance Demon Hunter, or Shifting Power for a Fire Mage to get its cooldowns back. The ones for Shamans were a little bit more shit, is actually the term I was looking for. Elemental Shaman sat on Necrolord because Primordial Wave of the niche abilities at its disposal was the one that gave them the most variety, the most versatility in different scenarios, but it was never that powerful. It wasn't adding much of anything in single target, it was adding practically very little in AoE, and you could only find a decent use on 2 or 3 targets where you could use multiple Flame Shock and fire off multiple lava bursts once every 45 seconds. Again, not particularly impressive. It was way more so usable by Resto Shamans. And this is a case closer to what we have about Windwalker, and less so about Subtlety. This is not some type of Covenant-specific legendary being released for a different Covenant, or the Covenant abilities themselves being significantly buffed. This is more of a case of Elemental Shaman deciding, agreeing with the damage profile that Blizzard put on them after they buffed them in 9.0.5. Elemental Shaman had its single target nerfed in exchange of gaining much more powerful AoE. At this point, you might as well fully gear your spec and your character for what you're already strong at. So Elemental Shaman went towards one of the stronger AoE builds you can go for, and this also includes Night Fae, which is ultimately the pick they went for when it comes to a Covenant, moving from Necrolord to Night Fae. The Night Fae Covenant ability in and of itself is nothing special. It's not going to do too much. The strength in AoE from Elemental is still going to be almost exclusively from its abilities and its legendary, which remain unchanged, both the build, the talents, and the legendary itself. is more so because of something we have talked multiple times before, which is Korain, the Night Phase Soulbind, which is far and away the strongest AoE Soulbind, particularly for Mythic Plus. And that is also the role in which Elemental Shaman has grown the most at the start of this patch and is continuing to, gaining more and more value, more and more ground as a Mythic Plus AoE focused spec. This is why the switch to Night Fae has happened. Now, after Elemental, we look at our first healer, because the other switch comes for Discipline. Now, Discipline, much like Shaman and much like Rogue, was in this situation where all of the Covenant abilities weren't particularly strong. They weren't making or breaking the entire spec. They were not looking for an Ashen Hallow, an Elysian Decree, a Wild Spirits, a Shifting Power, or anything of the sort. So they settled for what was better for their rotation, their build. Being Discipline, they do damage, and that damage is converted into a shield because they are playing with Spirit Shell, and the best use they could have with that type of playstyle was with Mind Games, the ability of Venthyr. Mind Games having a 45-second cooldown made it very easy to be able to have it available for every single Spirit Shell, so it was just a nice fit. Unfortunately for them, the playstyle was nerfed when Spirit Shell was nerfed multiple times. The maximum shield you could generate with Spirit Shell went from 100% to 80%, and the cooldown went from 60 to 90 seconds. So that build was made weaker. At the same time, back to what happened with Sub-Rogues, they were also releasing the Covenant-specific legendaries, and one particularly caught the eye of Discipline, which was the Covenant-specific legendary for Kyrian. Kyrian already had an intriguing possibility for Discipline Priests, which was Boon of the Ascended. Boon of the Ascended is spell damage. Spell damage works just fine with Atonement, even if it's not a priest ability. However, the cooldown was 3 minutes. The cooldown was very long. It wouldn't have fit in every single Spirit Shell. This would have meant you had one weak Spirit Shell and one strong Spirit Shell, so it was kind of wonky. It wasn't working that well. Then, Blizzard releases the new Covenant-specific legendary in 9.1, which is Sphere's Harmony. Sphere's Harmony can reduce the cooldown of Boon of the Ascended by a full minute, depending on your Boon of the Ascended stacks. The Boon of the Ascended stacks are generated by casting the abilities you can cast when you activate the Covenant ability. Those being Ascended Blast, which gives you 5 stacks of Boon of the Ascended, and Ascended Nova, which gives you 1 stack per enemy damaged. So of course, multiple targets, AoE situations makes this very strong. It can basically guarantee that you can get the full 1 minute discount as long as you're hitting 4 to 5 targets. So it started looking like a possible good alternative. What made it even good is looking at the new Soulbind's last capstone trait. Once Renown went from 40 to 80 in 9.1 and you gained more passive traits in the Soulbinds, this is what was given to Kyrian, to Mechanicus, the Effusive Anima Accelerator. This ability can reduce the cooldown of your major Covenant ability by a number of seconds based on the enemies you are hitting. The longer the cooldown of the ability, the more cooldown reduction you will get. In the case of Boon of the Ascended, which is very long, because it's a 3-minute cooldown, the maximum reduction you can gain is 60 seconds. So you enter a fairyland where you can get a 1-minute cooldown reduction with this passive from Mechanicus and a 1-minute cooldown reduction from the new Covenant-specific legendary, turning your Boon of the Ascended ability from a 3-minute to a 1-minute cooldown. This is effectively never happening in raids. There are not enough targets for you to hit in a raid to get that much of a discount, but it is possible to get it to a 1.5-minute cooldown rather consistently. The worst case scenario, if you can cap the stacks on Boon of the Ascended, is gonna be a 72-second cooldown discount. And this was decreed, and this was deemed good enough by Discipline Priests. Spirit Shell has been nerfed. Now we can play as an alternative with Evangelism. We can go over to Kyrian and we can use Boon of the Ascended. We will also be seeing in the near future if this is going to also change the status quo in Mythic Plus. Because now, as I pointed out, the utopian world of the 1-minute cooldown of Boon of the Ascended is much more likely and much more possible in Mythic Plus, where you can guarantee multiple targets being hit very often by Boon of the Ascended. This should give Discipline Priest not just much more healing, of course, but also much more damage, to the point that they should, or they might, start over-damaging, out-damaging Holy Paladin, whose sole reason for rising in the ranks in Mythic Plus was their damage. So it is going to be interesting if that particular situation is going to progress and give some more spotlight to Discipline in Mythic Plus. Now, of the last two specs remaining currently doing the best with their Covenant swap, one is obviously the one we have already seen before. It's already been talked about a few times in a few different situations. It's Balanced Druid. Balanced Druid running away from Nightfey, seeking refuge in Venthyr. The swap is gaining more and more ground. Remember, the first time we started covering this, the swap was among the 20 to 30%. Now it's up to 84%. In Mythic Plus, it's still somewhat a little bit more even because the purpose of this swap is not as powerful in Mythic Plus, but it is now definitely more and more prevalent. This entire swap was generated by the nerfs to Balance of All Things in particular. Balanced Druid in general was nerfed, but also their legendary. Their legendary giving them crit whenever they entered Eclipse made them very, very powerful, to the point that Blizzard thought it was kind of a problem and had to be nerfed. Back in the old days, the original idea was to give this legendary 105% crit, decaying over time. It was then nerfed at release to be 75%, and then nerfed again to be 50% crit, and lastly, the final nail in the coffin was nerfing it down to 24% bonus crit. This, coupled with the nerfs that Balanced Druid received to Solstice, to Starfall, made them look for a different solution to this. The solution was, of course, to drop this entire build, basically. Just don't use Solstice anymore, just don't go for this legendary anymore, and go play Venthyr. At the same time this was happening, Blizzard was giving out Covenant-specific legendaries, and the one for Venthyr was Sinful Hysteria. So they were already replacing their big cooldown Convoke the Spirits with Ravenous Frenzy, and this legendary was just making it even stronger. It can lead, of course, to some more interesting situations, hilarious situations, where a druid messes up the entire cooldown, gets stunned, and he is ruined, and he's doing less damage than a tank, but normally speaking, we can say it definitely bailed out Balanced Druid. You know, Balanced Druid was getting nerfed heavily, it looked like the end of the spec, and instead they found a way out. They snuck out from the swing of the nerf bat and were able to find another very well performing build. Now, finally, we can get to the last of the changes. We have already talked about two specs that went from Nightfey to join Venthyr, and now we have the last spec which is going to do the opposite. Arms Warrior. Arms Warrior was the underplayed of the two DPS Warrior specs for most of Shadowlands at the start in Castonatria, and Arms Warrior was playing Venthyr. As we got closer to 9.1 and we started getting more and more news and info about what was going to be into the actual patch, theory crafting and ideas came around to the point that Warriors started this migration away from Venthyr and into Nightfey. Now, this is more similar to the swap that Elemental did. It's not that anything related to Arms Warrior was buffed that made them better if they went Nightfey. It's not that they are going to be using the Covenant-specific legendary for Nightfey, and it's not that the Covenant ability of Nightfey is a be-all, end-all, super powerful ability that is going to massively buff Arms Warrior. Ancient Aftershock, the ability they are using, is in fact not that powerful. It gives them a little bit more help in AoE, which they kind of need, but is not really that impressive. It has just been a matter of scaling and a matter of becoming stronger over time. You were complaining where I kept telling you to not worry because Warriors scale, and that was just a meme and whatnot, but it is ultimately the truth. Arms has also been given even better scaling tools in this expansion, something like this bad boy right here. Rend went from a niche talent taken sometimes if the fight was strictly on two target and the execute phase was not so important that you wanted to take Massacre. Instead now, because of this 10% more critical strike damage, has made it much more impactful in the later stages of the expansion and given even more value to crit for an Arms Warrior. Arms Warrior also have other scaling tools other than their faster using of abilities, higher scaling of haste, something like Mortal Combo. Having an 18% chance to double hit with your Multi Strike works very well with the legendary they are using, Enduring Blow. This is on a similar note of good scaling to what Havoc Demon Hunters have, for example. Relentless Onslaught as a conduit, giving you a chance to double hit with Chaos Strike and then Cycle of Hatred, the talent that can give you I-Beam cooldown reduction when you get the Fury refund with Chaos Strike. So in the case of Arms Warrior, which is now over 90% playing Night Fae, is more of a case of natural progression of the power of the spec, more so than something that Blizzard pulled out last minute that worked perfectly for the build, like something happening to Balanced Druid, for example. Now that we have gone over them, these were all of the currently 6 best performing specs who have conducted a Covenant swap in 9.1. At the very least, it's kind of relieving that we have gotten 2 of them into Venthyr, 2 of them into Night Fae, 1 into Kyrian and 1 into Necrolord. Venthyr in particular was fighting to be the least popular of the Covenants right before 9.1. Now being able to gain both Subtlety and Assassination Rogues on top of, way more importantly, Balanced Druids, it's definitely gained way more ground than before. Kyrian has gained Discipline without really losing any major spec, so it's a plus for them as well. Night Fae is gaining Arms and Elemental Shaman, sure, but they are losing Balanced Druid, so that's a pretty big loss. The only one who seems to be losing out of all of this is Necrolord, which is unlucky since Necrolord was already the least played Covenant. Necrolord is gaining Windwalker Monk, which is already a less popular spec, less played spec particularly, while at the same time losing Elemental. So that pretty much puts them back to where they were at the start, perhaps even worse. And this was all for this Sunday evening. Afternoon, perhaps morning, depending on where you are, actually. Thank you guys for watching the video. If you have enjoyed, leave a like, perhaps a comment, maybe a subscribe. It's up to you. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, another day, another cloudy sky. It's chill. It's not even that hot. I might even think about using long sleeves. It's the 8th of August, man. What's going on?